and I live in mine. This is our great misfortune, these melancholy and separate existences. So you see, there's a great deal of documentary evidence that there really was this divide between the female world and the male world in France at this time, precisely over the role of the Catholic faith, both in the family and in society. This is the context of the origin of the Confraternity of Christian Mothers. And this goes back really to the time of the Revolution. Now, you find that when the Revolution attacked the faith and of course eventually intended to enforce a state-sponsored cult of reason and all this kind of business, that the vast majority of women resisted this. And one cultural historian writes, faced with what was crudely reduced to a stark choice between religion and revolution, half the adult population and the great majority of women rejected the revolution. Just briefly, I don't want to go too much into the history of the French Revolution, but just so you have the background, the earliest stages of the French Revolution were not necessarily deliberately anti or overtly anti-clerical. The very, very earliest stages, I mean. The goal with respect to the church was to correct some obvious abuses like bishops holding more than one diocese, or only nobility being allowed in the bishopric, and there was kind of a pitiful condition of the local pastors and cure. But very, very quickly, those kind of reasonable concerns were put aside, and a much more secular spirit infected the National Assembly. And of course, it came to a head with the civil constitution on the clergy, which mandated a loyalty oath to the new government and to the Constitution, deprived the Pope the right even to veto bishops, let alone to appoint them. And the most radical thing was the fact that clergy had to swear allegiance to this Constitution, which was clearly against the Constitution of the Church. And at first, clergy didn't know what to do. They didn't know if they were allowed to swear or not. Eventually, the Pope came out and said, "No, we're against this. This is contrary to Catholic faith." And so the French Church was split into jurors, those who swore, and non-jurors, those who didn't. And then, of course, the de-Christianization program begins, where they enforce the cult of reason, and non-juring Catholicism is outlawed, and priests who are non-jurors were put to death. And if you harbored a non-juring priest, you were put to death. And then sort of militarily, it came to a head in western France, northern France, in a region called La Vendée, when there was a revolt against the revolutionary government from 1793 to 96. About half the population, by some estimates, were killed by the revolutionary government. And their main rallying point was they wanted to reopen their churches, they wanted to reopen their parishes, and they wanted their priests back. They wanted the non-juring priests. They wanted their faithful priests back, and they were willing to die for it. And that was kind of the highlight, the high point of the anti-Christian persecution of the French Revolution, which didn't end, wasn't resolved, at least legally, until Napoleon. And Voltaire, of course, died before the Revolution, but the spirit that sort of animated the anti-Christian party would be encapsulated by the philosophy of Voltaire, the 18th century philosopher, who wrote, "Christianity is the most ridiculous, absurd, bloody religion that has ever infected the world." And of course, his great motto was, "Crush the infamy, écraser l'infâme." He wanted to wipe it off the face of the earth. So there's Napoleon as emperor. I put the title "A Separate Peace" on this because it was a separation of society. Napoleon temporarily resolved the legal problem in 1801. He signed a concord with the Pope, where the Church had legal status, was recognized for its traditional place in French society, but the government paid the salaries of priests. They did give the Pope the right of deposition of bishops. But it was not a conclusion highly favorable to the Church, but the Pope went along with it in the interests of peace and the survival of the Church. Over the course of the 19th century, I just want to point out the fact that Napoleon settled the legal problem of the Church's existence for 100 years didn't stop the cultural problem. The Revolution had created a cultural divide in France. Religion developed into the single greatest source of national discord in the 19th century. And briefly, we could trace that discord out over the course of the 19th century. France went through a number of different governments. Some were more favorable to the Church, some less favorable to the Church. But the forces of so-called republicanism, free thought, secularism were on the move, and they really reached the heyday in the 1870s, in the period of the Third Republic, when the government really began wholesale de-Christianization again and forced the Catholic influence out of education, out of social policy, culminating in 1905 with the Law of Separation, which formally declared France a secular state. And in effect, at least at the level of policy, the Catholic Church lost the culture war in France. So that's the background. Now, one thing that made the situation in France a little bit different from America is that many French Catholics viewed Catholicism and royalism as a piece. And they didn't have an intellectual system where they could recognize the goods of the rights of man, religious toleration and so forth, and recognize that democracy could be an intrinsic good. And these are all things that the Second Vatican Council, of course, has recognized. Freedom of religion, democratic government can be a valid form of government, and so on and so forth. At the time in France, there were some hard right Catholics that tended to view Catholicism in the mold of Joan of Arc being their ideal patron, who, of course, she's famous for having put the Dauphin on the throne and thrown out the English in support of the Catholic king. The Lord wills that the Dauphin be made king and have the kingdom in command, notwithstanding his enemies. He will be made king, and it's I who will conduct him to the coronation. And she sort of stood for royalist Catholicism. And so in the minds of her enemies, let me just see here. In the minds of her enemies, the Catholic Church could be construed as standing for reaction and monarchy and anti-progress and this kinds of things. The role of women in the culture war, we've already mentioned this. In the 1870s, the education of girls specifically was a high point in the assault of the government on the church. The education of girls was a particular of the Republicans, who were convinced that women's greater allegiance to organized religion was a source of division in families and a barrier to the spread of the Republican ideal. So the government went wholesale after specifically Catholic women in the field of education to attempt to secularize them. Now, this picture that I pulled off the internet is actually a photograph of the public high school in Lille, where the Confraternity was founded today. So, and the government won. They won that battle. All right, so what did the women of the Confraternity do about this? All right, well, the first thing they did, you've seen her name, Madame Louise Josson de Billam, wife of a court official, very much part of the bourgeoisie in northern France, presided over the foundation of the Confraternity. They had their first meeting in Lille in May 1st, 1850, and that is a photograph of a church in Lille. I have no idea if it has any connection to the Confraternity, but I can guarantee you that it's in Lille, and I'd be willing to bet that there were probably Confraternity meetings held there at one time or another. All right. Now, what did the Confraternity believe? All right. What did they believe? Now, I pulled this text from basically what was the 1860 version of Mother Love in France. Probably, I think it was the second edition of their formulary of the Confraternity. The goal of the Archconfraternity is to multiply the graces for which Christian mothers pray. To this end, the hearts of these mothers, united to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, place their vows, cares, and prayers together so as to bring down blessings from on high upon their children and families. All right, so it's a straightforward goal of asking for heavenly blessings on the lives of their children and their families through the intercession of the Immaculate Heart of Mary and attendance at Holy Mass. I mean, it is a very pious and devout goal, and you notice they're not in this text, they're not deliberately going after political policy, they're not assaulting the government, they're simply wanting to pray for the preservation of their families and of the faith of their families. Okay, how did they pray? This is exactly what they did in 1850. The exercises of the Archconfraternity are to take place at least once a month on the days to which the Holy Father has attached plenary indulgences. They consist in attending the Holy Sacrifice, celebrated for the intentions of the Christian mothers, and instruction is given during or after the Mass. At each of these meetings, they commend their special intentions to public prayer, followed by an Our Father and a Hail Mary. So, once again, that's from the 1860 version of the Mother Love. Now, I found some texts that showed specific examples of prayers that they offered for their families and answers to prayer that they recorded, and I thought they were interesting and instructive. So these, again, are from that social history I told you about, pulled right from their earliest archives and meetings minutes of their